Women and girls are 49% of the 18.2 million people in need of humanitarian assistance and face food insecurity, water shortages, disease, lack of access to basic life-saving services such as healthcare and education, poverty and deprivation of economic opportunities, and systematic exclusion and suppression of their rights. 6.3 million Yemeni women and girls are at heightened risk of gender-based violence.
Well, for more on this now, I'm joined by Niku Jafarnia, who's a researcher at Human Rights Watch, specialising on Bahrain and also Yemen. Welcome to the programme. Niku, 6.3 million Yemeni women and girls are at risk of gender-based violence. As someone that specialises in Yemen, what do you make of these UN findings?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I think, there's a couple of clear issues that are happening with women's rights in Yemen. Beyond just the risk of gender-based violence. I think in the last 10 years of conflict, what we're seeing is a massive restricting of women's movement, of women's freedoms in general. And as the conflict has progressed over a decade, we've seen that not only have the Houthis been restricting women's freedoms, which I think a lot of international organizations have commented on, including the UN, but we're also seeing that women's restrictions and rights women's freedoms and rights are also being restricted in government-controlled areas and by other warring parties. And so what does this mean? You're talking about women who can't move from one governorate to another without permission from a male guardian or a male family member. And what does that mean in terms of, being able to provide humanitarian aid for humanitarian aid workers that are women? It impacts women who are just seeking education in governorates that are different from where their family is. It impacts women who are even receiving health care. So, this is a massive problem that's widespread across the country. It's very much a controlled situation in the north and in Houthi-controlled territories where there's been regulations, promulgated by the Houthis that specifically state that women are not allowed to travel without a male guardian. But we're seeing that in less of a strategic fashion and less of a clear way. It's happening in the south as well, in various checkpoints specifically, even if there's no government-specific regulations about this.
And Niku, when we have such incredible statistics there, what influence can these UN findings have to help these 6.3 million women and more?
I mean, I think first and foremost, the government and other warring parties have always tried to say that they are upholding women's rights and say that they actually are, upholding human rights in general. So I think there's a lot of pressure that can be placed on them to change their actions and ensure that all of their actors within, the lower ranks even of their military and armed groups are also complying with those rules and ensuring that women's rights are protected. I think when it comes to the Houthis, we're talking about humanitarian aid provision. As you've already talked about, the majority of the country is in need of humanitarian aid, and the Houthis are not allowing women to be able to travel to even provide that humanitarian aid, which sometimes requires women to be there. So I think it's really necessary for international non-governmental organizations, for UN agencies that are providing humanitarian aid to keep raising this issue and keep placing pressure to ensure that they are only providing this type of aid if these restrictions are lifted.
Just update us, Niku, on the state of the humanitarian situation in Yemen. And we know the UN has always called it one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world after a decade.
Yeah, I mean, at this moment in time, over half of the population is in need of humanitarian aid. That means over half of the population does not have adequate access to food, to water, and to other basic life necessities. That's one thing. On the other hand, you also have a cholera outbreak happening at the moment. A few hundred people have already died from this cholera outbreak in just this year alone. And you also have over 100,000 cases of cholera. There's also the situation with flooding, where over 100 people, I believe, as of today, have died because of the floods. And so that's the broader set of issues that are facing the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. But simultaneously, humanitarian aid has been under attack by the Houthis over the last few months. The Houthis have been arresting UN staff at UN agencies, staff at INGOs, and staff at also civil society within Yemen. And that means that they're placing this major humanitarian aid operation at critical risk when agencies can no longer trust that their staff can be safe, specifically their Yemeni staff who are still living under Houthi-controlled territory where most of the needs are.
That's incredible. A very difficult situation for the people in Yemen and, of course, for the aid agencies to work in. Thank you so much for your time and giving us that first-hand information. Niku Jafarnia, really appreciate it. Thank you.